Part 3 of the Matthew Highlight Reel. First, looking at a condensed summation of the chapters overall. For Part 3, chapters 21 through 28, we get Holy Week and the events after, along with more analogy. Chapter 21, the first part, is about Palm Sunday and the beginning of Holy Monday. Verses 1 through 11 is a triumphal entry, when Jesus tells his disciples to get a donkey and a colt, which they do, and put their cloaks on them, and Jesus rides the colt into Jerusalem, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9, and the people call him prophet. Next, verses 12 through 13, Jesus gets ticked off and clears out the sinful activity going on in the temple. This is just one of the times he does that. Next, verses 14 through 17, the blind and lame come to Jesus at the temple and get healed, and kids fulfill Psalm 8:2. And then verses 18 through 22, Jesus makes a fig tree rapidly wither for not having figs, but only leaves, and this represents what will happen to people who appear on the surface to be born again, but really aren't and don't truly live like they are. The second part of the chapter is a continuation of Holy Monday. Verses 23 to 27, Jesus is asked where he gets his authority, and he responds by asking where John the Baptizer got his baptism authority. Answering a question with a question, copyright Jesus, 1st century. And neither of these two questions are answered yes or no. Verses 28 to 32, we get the My Two Sons parable. How it goes is a man asks his two sons to go work in the vineyard. One said he won't do it, but then later does. And then the other is the opposite. Says he will do it, but then doesn't do it. And they are representations. The first one represents people who openly aren't faithful, people who openly live in sin and are openly not Christians, but then become born again later. And the second son represents those who claim to be faithful, claim to be faithful to God, claim to love God, claim to be Christians, claim to be born again, but really aren't and live that way. Then finally, verses 33 to 46, we have the tenants parable. And how it goes is a landowner leases his vineyard to tenants. He goes on a trip to out of town, and then sends his servants to go get the fruits from his vineyard, but the tenants beat and kill the servants, and so then the landowner sends his own son to go get the fruits, but the tenants then kill him in order to get the vineyard, because now there's no son to pass it down to, so they can just keep it. That's their idea. But what the landowner does is put them to death and then lease the land to new people. And the tenants in this parable represent the Pharisees and anyone who is alike. And it corresponds to Psalm 118. Chapter 22, the first part of it is about who's asking. See what I mean in a minute. Verses 1 to 14 are the wedding feast parable. How it goes is a king sends his servants to go get the invitees to his son's wedding feast. However, the invitees all give excuses, so the king has them destroyed. And then the servants are told to and go throughout the streets and invite whoever they can find. But one man comes in wrong attire, not wedding attire, and so then cast out. And it represents three things. The invitees who all give excuses, they represent Israelites who reject the gospel. The servants going around inviting whoever they can find, that represents the Great Commission. And the man who did not come in wedding attire, who did not change, represents those who are evangelized but do not become born again. Him not changing into wedding attire is representation of someone not spiritually changing, i.e. being born again. Verses 15 to 22, the Pharisees asked Jesus if they should pay Roman taxes, and Jesus expresses that they should give what they owe to whom it's owed, which then includes their life and soul to God. Caesar had the coins minted, so he should have the coins, but God minted your soul and life, so he should have it. Then verses 23 to 33, the Sadducees, yes, I will keep using that joke. Sorry for those who hate it. Ask Jesus if a woman marries a man who then dies not leaving her children. This happens to her 7 times. Marries a guy, he dies, no children. Marries another guy, he dies, no children, so on and so forth. Then which man's wife will she be in the resurrection? Again, the Sadducees are asking that even though they don't believe in the resurrection. And Jesus points out how they do not get Scripture or God's power, because the faithful aren't really truly dead in the spiritual sense. And there's no marriage in the afterlife. Because in the afterlife, we do not get married, just like how angels in heaven who are obedient to God do not get married. However, that does not apply to demons necessarily. Topic for another. And then the second part is a continuation of who's asking. Really, the whole chapter is about who's asking. Because verses 34 to 40, we get another person asking a question. It is a lawyer Pharisee who asks Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And which Jesus gives it, and I bet we all know this. If you don't, go read it. And then finally, verses 41 to 46, Jesus turns the tables on all of them, asking his own question, asking the Pharisees, who is the Christ's father? They answer David, and then Jesus uses Psalm 110:1 and inquiry to show that the Christ is God's son, not merely just David's. Because otherwise David would not have used such language in that verse if the Christ is just some mere human being descendant from David physically, and that's it. He must also be descendant of God. Chapter 23, we have the scribe and Pharisee woes. First look at woes 1 to 3. Verses 1 to 12, Jesus denounces the Pharisees, saying that people should follow their correct examples and teachings, which the Pharisees themselves don't follow, but they should not follow any of their false teachings, like that of legalism, or any of their false examples, like they're doing only to get praise and privilege. And they should instead be humble and follow and obey God. Verses 13 to 14, we get woe 1, says that the Pharisees hold to what keeps them from salvation and makes others do the same. Verse 5, woe 2, Pharisees travel far in order to just make one convert that's even more sinful than they are. Verses 16 to 22, we get woe 3, Pharisees proclaim and enforce nonsensical oath rules. Now look at woes 4 to 7. Verses 23 to 24, woe 4, Pharisees follow rituals to the T, but don't consider and actually follow the righteousness that's supposed to be behind them. Verses 25 to 26, woe 5, the Pharisees make themselves look righteous, but really aren't on the inside, and which they should start with making themselves righteous on the inside first, then the outside. Verses 27 to 28, woe 6, which goes along with woe 5, says the same basically, but gives whitewashed tombs as an analogy for cleaning on the and for need to be clean on the inside, not just the outside, instead of using the cup and dish analogy from woe 5. Verses 29 to 26, final woe, woe 7. Woe ho. The Pharisees wrongly claim that they wouldn't have treated the prophets, of the Old Testament like their ancestors did, because they'll do evil against members of the early church, i.e. the apostles and deacons and so forth. So they are just like their ancestors, despite their false claims. And then finally, verses 37 to 39, Jesus laments over unbelieving Israelites using a mother-hen analogy, which shows that, yes, women reflect God's characteristics too. Though this does not make Jesus effeminate, obviously. And Jesus says that he'll return to the remnant of Israel, which is written mostly about in Romans. Chapter 24 is about eschatology, which is the subject of the end times. Verses 1 through 14, Jesus gives the signs of the beginning of the end. They are that the temple is destroyed, false Christs appear, wars and rumors of them occur, so do famines and earthquakes across the globe. The apostles will suffer, be executed, and hated. Many hateful, treacherous apostates will be around, so will false prophets. Lovelessness and other sins will increase. The gospel will be proclaimed to everyone, and then at some time after that, the end will come. But don't be alarmed by these things, because they're supposed to occur before the end, and there'll be salvation after the suffering during these things for those who are in Christ. And by the way, in verses 1 through 2, some take the temple destruction prophecy as a double entendre prophecy about what happened to the temple in AD 70 and to Jesus' body that's Friday. However, this seems quite different from the destroy the temple and I'll raise it in 3 days prophecy that it is actually about Jesus' body. And then verses 15 through 28, when the abomination of desolation, which is Emperor Titus's army, because Luke, instead of saying abomination of desolation, says the army that will desolate. When it is put in the temple, as in surrounding the temple and destroying it, when it's in the temple, everyone in Jerusalem should flee, for the tribulation will come sometime after that. There will be great tribulation because of that, and then sometime after that, since it doesn't say immediately, there will be the 7-year time period of the Great Tribulation. And it will be the worst it's ever been in human history. And that time will be cut short for the sake of the elect. And don't believe anyone who says, look, it's the Christ, since there will be so many false Christs and the real one will be unmistakable because there will be lightning that the whole world can see. Continuing the chapter and subject, verses 29 through 31, right after the tribulation, there won't be light from space. The sign of Jesus will appear in heaven. All people will mourn and see Jesus coming in the clouds, and he will send his angels to gather all the elect. And finally, verses 32 through 51. Just as one knows it's summer from the fig trees putting out their leaves, one can know the end is near by the signs. And generation he is talking to won't die until all the signs of the end times occur. That's what he means by this generation won't pass away. And this was all fulfilled in AD 70. It also says that no human mind knows when the end is, and people will be unaware when it happens, just as those were right before the flood, and so one must be constantly prepared for it. Yeah, you can't just check off a timeline to find out when the end is coming. It could happen at any point, even now. So those who are truly born again and therefore live prepared for it are blessed, but those who falsely claim to be born again and be like those who live prepared and don't revere God, but live in sin and do evil to the prepared, they will go to hell. Chapter 25, we get more eschatology, but in the form of parables. Verses 1 to 13, we get the 10 virgin parable. How it goes is these 10 virgins go to meet the groom. And by the way, this parable does not promote polygamy because it's just an allegory to make a point. Be clear. All right, they go to meet the groom. 5 of them were foolish and didn't take extra oil to be able to fill their lamps when the oil in it ran out, but the other 5 were wise and did. And when it had gotten so late that the foolish 5 ran out of all the oil that was in their lamps and had to leave to go get more, they missed the bridegroom, but the 5 didn't because they were Girl Scout prepared. And when the foolish 5 came back and asked the groom to let them join the wedding feast, he said that he didn't know them. And that's a scary thing, because this mimics when Jesus said that he'll say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And that's why there are multiple virgins, because they represent multiple human beings. Again, this has nothing to do with polygamy. That's not the point. It's like the old fairy tales from the Middle Ages and later. They're written to only make one point. Anything else is irrelevant. Verses 14 to 30 are the talents parable, and talents, not referring to natural skill, but a form of currency that existed back then. Which, as a side note, I'd like to point out, Matthew's gospel talks more about currency, if you've noticed so far, more than any other gospel account. I wonder why. Tax collector. Huh? So how this parable goes is a man gives his servants according to their ability. Talents. That's what he gives them. To one servant he gives 5 talents, to another he gives 2, and then to another he gives 1. Now the first one, who has the 5 talents, and the second one who has the 2 talents, both invest their talents to avoid confusion. I was saying currency. Invest their currency and get it doubled. But the third one, who just had the 1 piece of currency, he buried it. And when the man returned, the first servant, the one who had the 5, was put in charge of much. The second servant, who had 2, was put in charge of little. And the third one had his currency given to the first one and was then cast out. And obviously, these talents actually represent true talents and other currency. If you don't do with what God gave you, then you are not living for him, you are not serving him, and so that will be taken away from you, and you will be cast into hell for your life of disobedience to God, which is sinful. But, you use what God gave you for his will, for his work, living a life of obedience to God, you will get reward for that in the afterlife. How that works in all the details, don't ask me. Then finally, verses 31 to 46, we get Jesus saying that at the end he will tell the born again who lived subsequently doing charitable acts like clothing, feeding, giving drink to others, and welcoming them, and visiting the ill and in prison, that they will inherit the kingdom, and will tell to those who are not born again, who didn't live lives of doing such things, at least without doing them out of idolatry, because if you're not a Christian, even your charity is idolatry, they will go to hell with the demons, because hell is designated for demons to be punished there, not rule there. Chapter 26, the first part of it is about Spy Wednesday, as it's known by some, and part of Maundy Thursday. Verses 1 to 5, we get Jesus prophesying his crucifixion for like the 4th or 5th time, and the Sanhedrin's plot to do so, to have him crucified. Verses 6 to 13, Jesus is anointed at Bethany and says that the woman who anointed him there, what she did will be proclaimed everywhere the gospel is proclaimed. And that's exactly what's been happening. Who'd have thunk it? 2,000 years later, over 2,000 years later, around. Verses 14 to 16, Judas makes the deal to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver and begins looking for opportunities to betray him. And then verses 17 to 19, the disciples prepare for the Passover. The rest of 26 continues with Maundy Thursday. Verses 20 to 25, Jesus reveals his betrayal and betrayer by saying, "He who has dipped his hand into the dish with me is his betrayer," and Judas asking if it's himself, and Jesus replying, "You said so," which Jesus probably said this kind of whisperingly to Judas, to where the others wouldn't hear him, which would explain why they didn't know Judas was a betrayer until he actually went and did it. Verses 26 to 29, Jesus establishes the communion and says that he won't drink wine until after his death. Verses 30 to 35, Jesus says that all the disciples will be scattered. Peter denies that he will. Then Jesus tells Peter that he'll deny him 3 times before the rooster crows, and there's an unwritten twice there. Matthew felt only need to just write it in as if it sounds like after the rooster crows once, but from other accounts we understand that, full context is twice. And then Peter denies the prophecy of his own denial. And then verses 36 to 46, they all go to Gethsemane, and Jesus prays there, and then Judas and others appear. So continuing with Maundy Thursday, chapter 26, verses 47 to 56, Judas gives the signal to the men to know who's Jesus, and Jesus tells Judas to do what he came for. Then an unnamed disciple in this account, who is named Peter later in other accounts, strikes a high priest servant with a sword and is then chastised by Jesus, saying that the Father would send 12 angel legions if he wanted to. Yeah, he's not chastising Peter because he used a weapon. Because obviously Jesus had him get a weapon for a reason. It just wasn't for this reason, to stop his crucifixion, because trying to fulfill prophecy here. And so scripture is fulfilled. And then all the disciples scatter just like Jesus said it would happen. Who would have thunk it? Verses 57 to 68, Jesus is led to the Sanhedrin with Peter secretly falling behind. Then the hearing of false testimonies happens, and there are 2 saying that Jesus said he was able to destroy the temple and rebuild in 3 days. Then the Sanhedrin ask if Jesus is the Christ, Son of God. Jesus replies, and this is his only reply through the whole ordeal, "You said so, and from now on you'll see the Son of Man seated at God's right hand coming on heaven's clouds," or, something meaning that, obviously. And then Jesus is spat at, slapped, and mockingly asked, "Prophesy, who hit you? I think you know, genius." And then finally, verses 69 to 75. During all this, in the courtyard, a servant girl told Peter he was with Jesus. Peter replies that he doesn't know what she means. Then another servant girl said something similar, and Peter replied that he doesn't know who Jesus is, doing so with an oath. And a bystander tells Peter that he must have been one of those with Jesus because he has a Galilean accent, and guess there weren't really any Galileans in Jerusalem then, which makes sense, it's so far north from there. And then Peter replies as last time while invoking a curse. And then the rooster crows, again unwrittenly for the second time. Peter hears it and then goes and weeps. Then chapter 27 is all about good, aka Black Friday, though, when most people hear Black Friday, they think something else, so hence why we know it in America as Good Friday. Verses 1 to 2, Jesus is delivered over to Pilate. Verses 3 to 10, Judas feels worldly sorrow, not godly sorrow, worldly sorrow, throws the money into the temple, and then goes and hangs himself in the field that was bought by the Sanhedrin with his payment, with those 30 pieces, to fulfill Zechariah 11, 12, 13. And we know from Acts that after Judas hung himself, rope snapped or something happened and then his body spilled open. Excuse the gross imagery. And the Sanhedrin bought the field, but, they didn't accept the ownership of the money, so that's why it's accredited to Judas as, in technicality, buying it. since it's still technically his money. And all this fulfills and all this, as said, fulfills Zechariah 11:12-13, which is in what's called the Jeremiah scroll that contains all the writings of the prophets. Hence why you see it written as Jeremiah's prophecy, not Zechariah's, because it's quoting the whole scroll, not the particular prophet. Then verses 11-14, Jesus stood before Pilate, who asked him if he is king of the Jews, to which Jesus replied, "You said so." It's like the third time he said that. And then Pilate asks if Jesus hears all the many things that are being testified against him, to which Jesus didn't reply, which amazes Pilate. Continuing, verses 15-23, Pilate puts Jesus and Barabbas before the people and asks them who they want to be released. He did this because this was a custom at the feast. I don't care what a historian tries to tell you that such thing didn't occur. I don't believe you. There's enough documentary evidence from this. After this, or more during this, Pilate's wife sends word to him that he should have nothing to do with Jesus because she suffered in a dream, and this suffering in the dream related to Jesus. Probably seen visions of him crucified or something like that. And then all the people answer that they want Barabbas released. Pilate asks what to do with Jesus, and they all say crucify, and Pilate asks, but why? This is a fair question. Then verses 24-31, Pilate washes his hands, saying that, all right, Jesus' blood is not on my hands, but that's not true, because you could have just not ordered it. That was always an option. He then frees Barabbas, scourges Jesus, which that's worse than whipping, because scourging, you had multiple ropes or leather straps on and coming from one handle, and they had like bone and metal and other stuff all intricated in the strips or rope or whatever. That would then rip out chunks of flesh. So scourging compares nothing to whipping, in that scourging was far worse. After that, then Pilate hands him over for crucifixion. The soldiers then take Jesus into the Praetorium, which is kind of like the headquarters, and then strip Jesus and put a red robe on him, then put the crown of thorns on his head and a reed in his hand, mock him, spit on him, and strike him, including striking him with the reed that they put in his hand. And then they replace his robe with his own clothes and lead him out for crucifixion. Continuing still on chapter 27 about Good/Black Friday, verses 23-44, Simon of Cyrene, which is in Libya, so Simon was an African man, northern African man. He was compelled to carry Jesus' cross to Golgotha, which means place of the skull. It's also known as Calvary, like in the hymn. Jesus was then offered wine that was sour because it was mixed with gall, aka bile. Nasty. But, Jesus wouldn't drink it after tasting it, because remember, Maundy Thursday, he said, I won't drink wine until the deed's done. Then the soldiers divide up his clothes by casting lots, basically an ancient form of shooting dice or drawing cards, something like that. I don't know the specifics on that. Then Jesus' charge, as Matthew puts it, was put over his head, and it reads, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." The full thing says Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Matthew felt it was unnecessary to include of Nazareth because, everyone reading this knows, well, yeah, duh, it's Jesus of Nazareth. Who the heck has this whole account been about? And then after that, there's a robber crucified on either side of Jesus, and both of them mock him along with bystanders. And as we know from another gospel account, one of those robbers stops mocking him and then puts his faith in Jesus and is saved. Hallelujah. Verses 45 to 50, there was great darkness from Matthew using the Jewish time system, which he said is the 6th to 9th hour, according to the Jewish time system that Matthew used, which in modern time system is 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. And then Jesus cries out in Aramaic, if I remember how to pronounce it correctly, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That's how it goes. But those around who didn't understand Arabic thought he was calling for Elijah because, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And then a bystander, who in another gospel account is identified as a Roman soldier, put a sour wine-filled sponge on a reed and offers it to Jesus, and then Jesus yields up his spirit. And then verses 51 to 56, the temple curtain is cut all the way down the middle, split all the way down the middle, and some rocks are also split open too. The earth shakes. Many saint bodies arise out of the tombs into Jerusalem, which I know sounds incredibly fantastical, and you think, it'd be like all over ancient news, but come on. There are answers to that. I just currently don't have them, but trust me, you can find them. Go look it up on your own time. And then after this, or more during this, the centurion who was there, a centurion who was there, possibly Cornelius from Acts, says that Jesus was at least a son of God or the Son of God, depending on, how you translate the text. And then Mary Magdalene, Mary, who was James and Joseph's mom. These are probably James and Joseph, different from any James and Joseph named up to that point. Along with the sons of thunder, James and John, the disciples, their mother, all of them looked on, along with many others who had followed Jesus during his ministry while this happened. And wrapping up chapter 27, continuing even still with Black Friday and starting into Black Saturday, verses 57 to 61, that evening, Friday evening, the rich disciple of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a Pharisee, asked Pilate for Jesus' body, to which he was then ordered by Pilate to be given, and Joseph wrapped it in a clean linen shroud, laid it in his newly rock-cut-in tomb, and sealed its entrance with a huge stone, as Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sat opposite. But which other Mary? I'm not certain, because there were 5 of them in the 1st century. And then you have Mary number 6, i.e. Miriam from the Old Testament. A lot of Marys. Get a new name. And finally, verses 62 to 66, the next day, Black Saturday, the Pharisees tell Pilate that Jesus said he'd rise after 3 days, so his tomb should be made secure. Secure is not a word. My bad to all the grammar sticklers. No, I'm kidding, you're all right. It should be made more secure till then, till after those 3 days, because they think that Jesus' disciples might steal the body and claim that he rose and then make everything worse, which for the disciples to steal the body, that would seem like the dumbest and out-of-pocket thing ever in history, because grave robbing, you steal what is in the grave besides the body, and corpse robbing is stealing off of the corpse all the valuables that are on the corpse, not the corpse itself. Even corpse robbing is not stealing the corpse itself. Nobody would do that. This would be the only situation that would ever be relevant, basically. And then Pilate replies that they have guards and to go and make the tomb more secure. And they do so. They seal the tomb's huge stone over the entrance and set up guards. The final chapter of this book, 28, which is about Resurrection Sunday, verses 1 to 10, Mary Magdalene and Martha's sister, along with other women who weren't mentioned because Matthew just thought, unnecessary, headed to the tomb toward dawn as recorded by Matthew, and an angel rolls the massive stone over the entrance away, causing a quake, and then sits on it and tells the women that Jesus isn't there and to go tell his disciples about it, and that Jesus will see the disciples at Galilee. The women go run to do so, which, think about it, this is the first century. Well, yeah, this is the first century where women did not really get kind of any respect, at least by most. Sorry, ladies. So for them to be the first witnesses, you got to be thinking, you're nuts. I thought you wanted to be reliable. Exactly. Well, they go to do this, and on their way, they're greeted by Jesus. They grab his feet and worship him, and he tells them to go tell his disciples. Verses 11-15 tell us that, meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, while that was going on, some of the guard told the chief priests all that had occurred and were paid by the Sanhedrin to say that they were sleeping on the job, and the Sanhedrin said that they'll protect the guard. Why do they need protection? Oh, because this is a first century Roman occupied region. If you're a guard or a soldier or anything like that, you don't say you were sleeping on the job unless you literally want to die. And this story was still being used, that the guards were sleeping on the job was still being used by many, especially Jews, to the very day this document was written, which, various sources, just about all of them, will give you a range of 10 years when it was written, but which 10 years varies, so I'll just say it was written sometime from AD 55 to 90. That's kind of the major range when you combine all the different sources. It's more likely on the sooner half than the latter half. The latter half is more by hyperskeptics. And then finally, verses 16 to 20, the 11, who are left, because he just killed himself, sadly. Sadly, because suicide is always a terrible thing. They went to the mountain in Galilee that Jesus directed them to go to. They saw and worshipped him there, even though some of them doubted. Yeah, more than just Thomas doubted. Poor Thomas. Thomas is more known for doubting than Peter is for denying, because he's not called denying Peter, but he is called doubting Thomas. Poor Thomas, no respect. And after this, Jesus gives the Great Commission. Now in this video, looking at some key verses from some of these chapters. 21:43 says, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits." 22:37 says, "And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." 23:12 says, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." 25:45 says, "Then he will answer them, saying, truly I say to you, as you did not do to one of the least of these, you did not do to me." And finally, 27:51 says, "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split."